right, welcome to the Here on Earth podcast mini-series entitled Here and Now, where we are having conversations regarding race, mainly here in the state of Minnesota, the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, but obviously a lot going on in our world as well. My name is AJ Mansour, Josh Cohn, co-host here as well. And today we're joined by a very special guest who is going to help us break down some of the history, going back to the history of our state, the history of slavery in the state of Minnesota. Maybe you're like me and you just didn't think there was a history of slavery in the state of Minnesota. We're going to learn about the impacts that slavery did have on the state and its founding and the basis for a lot of things that we take for granted here in the state of Minnesota. But the expert that we're looping in to the conversation today, his name is Dr. Chrstopher Lehman. He is a professor at St. Cloud State, and he is an author as well. Slavery's Reach, the most recent book, award-winning book as well. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Lehman. We appreciate you taking the time for this conversation.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I mentioned briefly the idea that many of us, and I grew up in Minnesota, Josh grew up in Minnesota, I can speak for myself. I for sure did not know that there was, period, a history of slavery in the state of Minnesota or impacts of slavery in the state of Minnesota. I just have this assumption naively that we are about as north as it can possibly be. We're part of the Union. We were on that side of the Civil War and the discrepancies of our country at that time. But in reading some of your work, reading about your book, reading excerpts from your book, and watching some videos that you have put out, the history of slavery in Minnesota is profound. I mean, it has had impact on a lot of things that we take for granted. Maybe take us back to the beginning and how you got into doing this research and where you even got the idea to dive in to see what might be the history of slavery in Minnesota.
Well, like you, I didn't have any idea that slavery existed in Minnesota until I started looking into it. And the only reason that I looked into it was because I'm not originally from here. I moved here to Minnesota 18 years ago. And one of the things I like to do whenever I'm in a new environment is to learn about the history of it. And I had heard from different people in the St. Cloud community that African Americans had only been in town since the 1950s or 60s. But all I had to do was go to the Stearns History Museum and open one book and learn that that wasn't true, and that there were African Americans who were kept as enslaved people back in the 1850s. And that totally blew me away. And so I wanted to learn more about how that could happen in a place that was a free state, and before that, the free territory. So my research originally was me trying to find as many African Americans in Minnesota in the 1850s and 60s as possible, and then see if they came from southern states. And then I could make a guess as to whether they were slaves or not. But that's not very conclusive research. And then maybe about 5 years ago, I started reading books that looked at capitalism and how the transfer of money is really important in understanding slavery. So I thought about what I could look at in terms of documentation that would show a financial transaction between a slaveholder and a Minnesotan. And then it hit me. I could look at real estate deeds. So I started looking at real estate deeds first in Stearns County, and then in counties all along the Mississippi River, because when Southerners would come to Minnesota, it would usually be in the spring and summer, because that's when the Mississippi River is thawed. And they were essentially our first snowbirds. They came here when the weather was warm, and based on how much money they had and how much money they had to burn, they may stay for a week, they may stay for the entire summer. And they were able to take their slaves with them and not have anything happen to them. Now, why that exists is because even though there were two federal laws by 1820 that said that this land that eventually became Minnesota is supposed to be free and there are not supposed to be any slaves on it, the federal government actually broke its own laws because Fort Snelling was built. And when Fort Snelling was constructed in the 1820s, the fort needed to have soldiers there. And the federal government told soldiers from the South, specifically from Jefferson Barracks in Missouri, if you want to bring one or two slaves with you from the South to Fort Snelling, go ahead. I know what the law is, but go ahead. It'll be okay. We'll even give you a stipend to help pay for the care of your slaves while they're here. And so that was the first compromise of the law. And then about the same time, the fur trade began to develop. And there was a company called American Fur, which was owned by a company that was co-owned by 3 slaveholders from St. Louis, Missouri. So what that meant was anybody in Minnesota working in trading posts for American Fur were actually working for the slaveholders. And that includes people that we would consider to be Minnesota's founding fathers, like Henry Sibley, Henry Rice, Charles Borup, John Prince, the founder of Princeton, Minnesota. All these people were working in the fur trade, so they were working for these St. Louis slaveholders. And they were even working, well, some of them were working for the slaveholders well into the 1850s, for a couple people into the 1860s. So this is even after Minnesota has become a free state. There are people who have public office who are getting paid by slaveholders, so they're going to compromise the anti-slavery policy. Henry Sibley, for example, he was the first governor of Minnesota when it became a free state in 1858. So that meant that since he was still working for the company, which was Choteau and Company, he was this governor of a free state getting paid by slaveholders. So he wasn't going to enforce any anti-slavery laws very strongly. Now, I talked about the Mississippi River, and that tourism really takes off, especially starting in 1854, when the technology for steamboat travel is good enough for people to sail from the south to the north, and vice versa every year. And around the same time in 1854, Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which says that any territory can decide for itself whether it wants to be a slave state or a free state. And some Minnesotans think that that law applies to them and not just to Kansas and Nebraska territories. And then in 1857, the United States Supreme Court has the Dred Scott decision. And that decision says that if you're any territory, north or south, you can have slavery. It doesn't matter how far to the north you are. And since Minnesota is not yet a state in 1857, slavery is legal here. It was legal for 14 months, from March of 1857 until May of 1858. And during that year-long period, there actually was an influx of people coming from the South with their slaves, because they knew that when they came here, nobody was going to touch their slaves and try to free them. And that meant that there was an influx of tourism dollars, too, for all those communities along the Mississippi River that welcome the Southern tourists every year. And then when Minnesota became a free state, Minnesotans decided, well, we still need that money from the slaveholding tourists, so we're not going to try to free their slaves when they get here. And they didn't. And Minnesota was so desperate to hang on to that money that when Minnesotans elected a Republican governor in 1860, there were Southerners who were afraid that with a Republican in office, Minnesota would try to take the slaves away. So just to show good faith, there were some people in Minnesota in the legislature who actually tried to pass bills that would make slavery legal in Minnesota. And this is after it was already a free state, 2 years afterwards. So in 1860, there was a bill in the House and a bill in the Senate calling for slavery to be legal just during the tourism season and just for the tourists. Fortunately, both of those bills failed, but they didn't fail unanimously. And there were quite a few people who were lawmakers who were also selling land to slaveholders. And so they were the ones who tended to vote to make slavery legal in the free state of Minnesota.
Wow. I mean, I just, first of all, that just kind of blows my mind. As AJ said, I grew up in Minnesota. If you don't know my history at all, my mom's Black. I actually have been to the plantation in Missouri where my ancestors were slaves. That's where my grandpa's family is from. It was destroyed in a flood when I was a kid back in '93, so I haven't been since. But it was always that, which is a humbling thing to understand that. But I think like most people, we think of that as a Southern problem. And we think, growing up in Minnesota, we didn't have those problems. I guess my first question is, when you talked about like why you decided to look that up and stuff, how important is it for people to do history and to look into this kind of stuff? So when we talk about the racial issues in our country, but even in our own state of Minnesota, very northern state, as AJ said, how important is it, or how easy is it to do history? It sounds like you did a lot more, obviously, for your book than most of us average everyday people would do. But I guess how important is the history and learning the history? How important is that for us to do?
Well, I think it's extremely important, and I've seen it play out in how some people respond to what's happened since the killing of George Floyd. I've looked at different comments on social media, and more than one person has said, in effect, why are people saying that what happened to Floyd goes back to slavery? Minnesota never had slavery. And so that's their first mistake from not knowing history. And I think if more people were aware of the history, they would see what happened with Floyd as a continuing pattern as opposed to something coming from out of the blue. Because it is very deep in Minnesota's history. One of the things I look at in my book, for example, is that during that Dred Scott summer, when slavery was legal, here in St. Cloud, there was a slave who tried to escape from his or her master from a hotel in St. Cloud. And there were a couple of local people who were trying to help. But people who were considered to be law enforcement in St. Cloud came out and stopped the runaway, brought the runaway back to the master in the hotel. And since it's the job of the police to enforce the law, and since Dred Scott was the law, if you were a cop, you had to do that, no matter how you felt about slavery. And this being 1857, that's only 1 year after St. Cloud is established. So from the very start, there have been these problematic relationships between African Americans and law enforcement in our own state. And what I really wanted people to come away from with reading my book is the understanding that Minnesota is not this exceptionally pure state. And you can't have such a thing in a country where slavery was so important to the national economy. As much as we know about how many industries slavery helped establish and how many buildings were constructed with slave labor and so forth, you just can't live in a country that dependent on slavery and not be affected by it at all. And since we know that Minnesota existed as a territory and a state for the last 16 years of legal slavery, we know that Minnesota was affected somehow. And what I tried to do with my book was to show how. And real estate deeds were the best way that I thought I could do that.
For sure. We're living in a day and age where social media unrest has led to this term that has been dubbed cancel culture. Statues of soldiers and lieutenants and from back in the day that were Confederate or that had slaves or whatever it might be. Now you threw out some names already. Henry Sibley, you mentioned in your book Pillsbury. You mentioned Dred Scott. These are for me growing up here. Dred Scott, these are monuments. There's softball field complexes. There's high schools across our state that are named after these people who inherently, there's different varying degrees of this cancel culture. The Columbus statue was just pulled down recently at the Capitol. Would you say that being complicit in the economy maybe of slavery, as much as being complicit in the legislature that passed for temporary periods of time, or for that just wasn't enforced? What are your thoughts, I guess, on cancel culture? Is it good to wipe the slate clean of honoring people like this, or is this part of our history that is just, it's important to know? It's important to know both sides of the history. The Henry Sibley that founded this area, and the Henry Sibley that maybe founded it through nefarious ways of getting money. Is that important as well?
When it comes to cancel culture, I think it's important to realize that monuments are not history books. I know that people who complain about statues being taken down and so forth are saying that that gets rid of history. That's not true, because nobody goes to a statue instead of going to school. Nobody goes to a statue and reads inscriptions instead of reading books. If you take down a statue, the history's still going to be there. Just go to a library or go to a bookstore and get a book and read. Also, when it comes to statues being placed, it's usually years after the person being honored has lived and died. That's certainly the case for the Columbus statues. But it's even the case for most of, say, the Confederate statues. There's a big wave of Confederate statues that was built in the 19-teens, and that was around the time that World War I was taking place, and African Americans were leaving the South for the first time. They were going overseas and finding that the rest of the world is not segregated like the Jim Crow South was. And so many veterans from that war come back to the United States wanting to do something to get rid of segregation. And so what the South did to try to put those people in their place, or at least one of the things they tried to do, was to have these statues of Robert E. Lee and everybody else to sort of remind African Americans, this is where you are. This is what we've always thought of you, and this is the way we're always going to think about you. Don't get any big ideas just because you went overseas. So the 19-teens was the first wave of those Confederate statues. The second wave was in the 1960s, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, with the marches from Dr. King and the sit-in students and all of that. And so that wave was to try to tell the new generation of activists, no, this is your place, because of all these people who died for the cause of keeping you in that place. Maybe you remember a woman named Green Newsom, who a few years ago had climbed up this flagpole right outside the South Carolina the South Carolina government building, to take down the Confederate flag that was flying as part of the state of South Carolina government. Now, that Confederate flag had only been in front of that building since 1962, and it was put there as South Carolina's statement to its African Americans, don't even think about life without Jim Crow. It's here to stay. So when Bree Newsom climbed up that flagpole, it was just right after Dylann Roof had killed all those people in the South Carolina church. And she saw the flag as a symbol of the oppression that had been taking place for a century and a half after the Civil War ended. And eventually it was put back up, but then the South Carolina government itself took it down for good, because they saw that it was a powerful symbol, and a powerful symbol that South Carolina's people was ready to move on from.
So one of the things that I thought about in just reading about you or talking to you now even is just, I mentioned a little bit the importance of history. Do you, and if you have an opinion on this, but do you think Black history is taught enough? Do you think that Black history needs to be more a part of just American history? I mean, what do you think? Or does there need to be more Black history classes? Is the month of February enough? I mean, how do we, cause that's one thing that I think is that in a lot of the stuff that's going on right now, whether it's, you know, George Floyd, Minneapolis, or the Ferguson stuff before that, I feel like my generation is really kind of, I guess, learning about racism for the first time. I feel like that's a lot of the reaction that I'm seeing, and that's why there are such big reactions, because you know, we learned about the Civil War in history books. We learned about Martin Luther King in history books, but unless you really took the time to learn more or to really understand that, you know, it wasn't that long ago. Dr. King wasn't that long ago. But I think this misunderstanding of history, or maybe it's because you actually took the effort to learn more. Not everybody's doing that. Maybe there's a lot more people doing that now. I think that's one of the good things that's maybe coming about these conversations that we're having, is I think people are doing more research and looking into it more. But I guess, how do you feel about the how Black history is handled in America, maybe particularly here in Minnesota or St. Cloud where you teach?
Well, I think any history in general likes to have a narrative structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And certainly when it comes to the less attractive parts of our history, people try to make it as attractive as possible. So when you have the civil rights movement, for example, you have the beginning of segregation, you have the middle of the bus boycott and the I Have a Dream speech, and then you have the end, segregation's dead. And so it seems like it's this crisp narrative that has a definite cutoff point. And so I don't think people are educated to think about the lingering effects of that history. They think that the end of Jim Crow really is the end, and it's just a clean slate from 1965 onward without any kind of lingering struggle. And you can make the same case for slavery, starting in 1619, and then having this violence over 200 years later with the Civil War, and then the war is over and the slaves are freed, the end. But it's just not that cut and dry. And I think what helps is to talk to people who are our elders. I'm fortunate to have my father still be alive. He was born in 1941. He just turned 79 last month. And his mind is still good, so I can have conversations with him where he'll talk about how he lived through sitting in the back of the bus as a kid, or how he lived through going to a colored school. In fact, I just learned last year more about his childhood growing up in Oklahoma and then going to Kansas to desegregate the high school that he went to there. He spent, I think, 3 years there because it was this religious school. He was supposed to be trained to be a minister. He decided after his junior year, he didn't want to do that. And so he came back to Oklahoma and he went to the colored school that he had to go to. And one of the first things that he saw was that the textbooks that he was being assigned were the same ones that he had just had at the white school years earlier. So he lived through that experience of colored schools getting the hand-me-down textbooks. So when you talk to people who live through these things, then you see that it's not cut and dry history, and that the people who are still living, who experienced those things from long ago, it's affecting their lives today. You know, the way that my parents experienced segregation certainly affected how they raised my brother and me. You know, whenever we would go on road trips, we would never deviate from the interstate unless we had to. We would not go on any state roads. We would not go on any county roads. If we had to use the bathroom and we were coming upon an exit, but we couldn't see a gas station or McDonald's from the highway, we would keep driving until we could. And if we really had to go, then there was an empty milk jug that we could use until we could find a gas station or something. But we were raised that way because my parents had experienced Jim Crow in road travel. Now, before 1964, it was perfectly legal for gas stations and restaurants to refuse to serve you. So you had to come prepared. You had to have your own jug for pee. You had to have your own food prepared. So if a McDonald's wouldn't serve you, at least you had a sandwich in the car or you had some fruit in the car. So I'm sure the way that my parents raised me is affecting how I'm raising my kids now too. So it doesn't end. It keeps going, maybe not in the ways that we might think, because not all those ways are written down in the textbooks.
Full vulnerability here. Growing up here, living in primarily a Caucasian community, a lot of these things, Juneteenth, we just celebrated Juneteenth, weren't really on my radar growing up. And it wasn't an overt racist attempt by my community or my family or anything there. It just wasn't part of what we learned at school, like you're mentioning now. It wasn't part of what we learned at home. And that's part of the reason why, specifically I'm looking to dive into these conversations, but also to share them, to use this platform that we have to get this information out there, this history, the recent history, the things that are still happening with these conversations. How important is it for people of any background, any race, to really know these things, to understand that this is how the world was, this is how the world is. It may not be as different as maybe we think it is, but how important is it for everybody to know these things?
I think it's extremely important. It's okay to disagree with people about their opinions about our history or about how free people feel they are. But if you don't listen to those other voices, at least, then you have no idea of where other people are coming from. And having ignorance about such a great big part of the population really does harm to a democracy. Now, if you take Juneteenth, for example, if you don't learn about slavery except as the narrative of once there was freedom and then after the Civil War there wasn't, if that's all you know, then it's based on what African Americans experienced before this military victory, which is usually credited just to the Union troops. So you learn nothing about how African Americans struggled to be free, and you don't really learn about their perspectives about being free. And so you don't learn about Juneteenth and why Juneteenth was so important, why Juneteenth remained important for years after 1865. If you know about Jim Crow and just how savage it was, then you have a greater appreciation for why it was so important for African Americans to celebrate being free every June 19th. For some communities, it had to be a reminder of them that as bad as things were, they still weren't slaves anymore. And I think the more that we're aware about the struggles of other groups of people, the better an idea we have about what it means to be free. I think as Americans in general, of course, we celebrate the 4th of July and America's independence from Britain. But if we have an awareness of history and we know that on July 4th, 1776, there was still slavery in America, and slaves would still come in from the African continent for another 3 decades after the Declaration, then you have an understanding that, of course, people who are descendants of slaves would not consider July 4th, 1776 as their date of freedom, that you would have to go almost 9 decades later to 1865, to Juneteenth, to have some kind of more symbolic date of freedom that's accurate when nobody can legally be a slave anymore. Now, both dates are important. I think it's important that the United States have these ideas of democracy and freedom, but it's also important to know that they weren't applied to everybody. And so while it's good to celebrate when the ideas were formed, it's really important to celebrate when they were implemented and to acknowledge that it took 89 whole years after the Declaration for them to be implemented, or at least to start being implemented.
Yeah, and I think to what AJ was talking about, learning about Juneteenth, I come from a half Black family, and to my point about African American history, about Black history, like I didn't know about Juneteenth until maybe a few years ago, and it's obviously really gained popularity. I think this year is the first year that I've seen kind of everybody, for the most part, celebrate it. But I guess my last question for you is just kind of, in writing this book, in this conversation, we learned a lot, I think, about the past, about Minnesota and its history. But my question is, because I'm always someone that tries to think, okay, but now what? What do I do about it? So what would besides go buy your book and read the history about it, what is it that we would do? Is it learn more? Is it conversations? What do you think we should do now with this new information that we have?
Well, I think once you have the information, then you think about how you might have been misinformed, or how you might have been uninformed about something and how that affected your life up until you read new information. And then you make a conscious choice that you're going to think differently and that you're going to behave differently based on the new information you have. I don't think there's anything worse than someone who gets exposed to new information and just decides, you know what, I'm still going to go with my gut, forget the facts. So I think it's important, for example, for us as Minnesotans to think of ourselves as people who are from a state that was very dependent on slavery. Now, even though we had it legally for 14 months, we still were dependent on the money from slavery for a long time. We, as Minnesotans, sold land to different people who held slaves. Now, in some communities, it was not as big a deal as others, like in St. Paul. There are neighborhoods that were dependent, but it would be a stretch to say that the entire city was dependent on slave capital. But in Belle Plaine and in Shakopee, and you could even make a case for St. Cloud, that money is very important. In Belle Plaine and Shakopee, there were families who sold all their slaves in the South before they came to those towns, and then basically bought up almost all the land. In St. Cloud, the first mayor was someone who was from the South, and he had asked friends and acquaintances from the South to come to St. Cloud and buy land from him. And so they did. And with that money, the mayor was able to start St. Cloud's economy, basically. So I think that when we know more information, or we know different information, and we act differently on the basis of it, that goes a long way towards changing things. I think once you read a book like mine, you can't unread it. You can't unknow about slavery being so important to Minnesota. And so once you know it, then you don't talk about Minnesota being always free anymore. And if people have questions, then you can point them to my book. You can point them to my email address. I'm a public employee, so people can write to me with questions or comments that they have. But it's important to just have the conversations and to keep the dialogue going, like we're doing now.
Absolutely. Last one, and then we'll let you go about your day. I appreciate the time. You're a college professor. Most of your students are probably 18, 19, 20 years old. Do you feel like this generation, that it's different, that this time around, obviously with the horrible events in Minneapolis recently, that it's different, that there's a different momentum that is starting to swing towards making actual change in our world?
I think so. Now, I'm 46 years old, so I was 18 when the verdicts for the officers who beat Rodney King were not guilty, and then the LA riots happened. But when that video had come out a year earlier, that was something new, because that kind of recording of police brutality was just not common. It was just that somebody happened to have a bulky camcorder and happened to be where the scene was taking place and film it. But now the technology is just more accessible. People have their iPhones and they can record, and they have been, and they've been making those videos viral with the internet. And ever since, I guess, the beating of Trayvon Martin in 2012, these videos have been very prominent on pretty much an annual basis, and of course, a lot of years having more than one very gruesome video becoming viral. So if you're in Generation Z and half your childhood, or maybe all of your childhood, depending on how old you are, is filled with the news of these viral videos, then that affects the way you see the country differently than someone my age. The way that I see it, I think people who are Generation X, my generation, and maybe millennials too. Now, we're the first ones who grew up after Jim Crow. So we're the first ones who spent our entire childhoods with no white only or colored only signs at all, and with segregation being illegal. So if you don't have any very visible signs of inequality in front of you, you just take for granted that everybody's free and everybody's equal, and you live your life accordingly. But with Generation Z, you have these viral videos of police brutality year after year after year. You have George Floyd, and you have Philando, and you have Eric Gardner, and you have Trayvon, and you have Tamir, and Breonna and Sandra. And you have all these just coming at you constantly, and you see the inequality. You see people being treated differently because of the color of their skin. And that's going to affect how you see justice. That affects how you see freedom too. And if you see that people are definitely not free, then if you want to preserve freedom, you're going to act on it more intensely than, say, older people. And so I think that's part of the difference, is that younger generations see the inequality. And I think it hits them personally because, a cell phone is just so small. It's in your hand. And when you're holding something in your hand that's valuable, you try not to break it. And while you're holding something valuable, you see this brutality taking place. And so it has an effect on you. Now, I've read history books about how important it was for Black people, or for African Americans, to be on TV in the 1960s, because if you were watching African Americans on television, that meant that you virtually had them in your living room. And if you could go a half hour or an hour with a person of color in your living room, then, maybe you can go the extra mile and have a cup of coffee with them. Or maybe you can go out of your way to have them over for dinner in real life. So I think that's why things are different with this generation.
Yeah, for sure. Well, he is Dr. Chrstopher Lehman, the chair of the St. Cloud State Department of Ethnic, Gender, and Women's Studies. Your book, which, congratulations, I know, award-winning book, is available now. It's called Slavery's Reach, and it is available at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Minnesota Historical Society, a bunch of places you can get it. We'll have links for it under this video, under this podcast, wherever you're listening or viewing this. But thank you, Dr. Lehman, for your time. Thank you for your work unearthing these things that aren't readily known and sharing them with the masses. Hopefully people can hear this and learn from it and share that, and can continue these viral ideas that you're bringing to light to just make our state a better place. So thank you for that. Thank you for the time today. We do really appreciate you joining and having this conversation with us.
Well, thank you for the conversation. I appreciate it.